Keith Strupp is the Washington lobbyist for NORML, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. He'll soon be leaving NORML, but in the past 8 years he's done a great deal to make America more tolerant of marijuana use by adults. Keith Strupp believes that the use of marijuana should be restricted to adults. He's worried about the increase in chronic marijuana smoking among young people.
There is a tendency on the part of young people today to underestimate the potential for harm from psychoactive drug use, I think. I would caution them against this. There is no such thing as a totally safe drug, and I don't think marijuana is going to be the first. It should obviously not be a daily habit, and in particular, it should not be something people do before they attend school or before they study for exams or things like that.
In the White House and other key government positions, Dr. Robert DuPont also helped to liberalize American attitudes toward marijuana. Now in private practice, he has had second thoughts. In the past, you've said publicly that marijuana is less of a hazard to health than tobacco or alcohol. Why have you changed your mind?
For two reasons. One is we know a lot more about the health hazards of marijuana now and how dangerous it really is. But two, and equally important, is that I now realize that this has been interpreted by the public as meaning marijuana is okay. We're so used to alcohol and tobacco that we assume if marijuana is no worse, then why not get used to marijuana? That is a disaster, and I feel very badly to have contributed to that.
Just as for 20 or 30 or 40 years, people oversimplified and exaggerated the dangers that might be present from smoking marijuana, I think there is a tendency today, especially among young people, to assume the other direction, that because marijuana isn't a killer drug, that therefore it's totally harmless, or in some cases they actually believe it's a panacea.
Marijuana is no panacea, but like any other drug, it does have potential medical applications. For example, it's believed to be useful in treating certain kinds of glaucoma. And here at the National Institutes of Health, it's being tested as a means of relieving the agonizing side effects of chemotherapy in some cancer victims. And there are other current experiments. But all of them are just that, experiments to determine whether marijuana, or in some cases THC alone, can help the victims of serious disease. The problem is that by the time news of these experiments reaches the schoolyard, the information has become garbled. Some of the children we spoke to were convinced that marijuana had been proven to be a safe medicine for asthma, cataracts, even cancer, and that marijuana was not merely harmless, but beneficial, like vitamin pills.
And a lot of people think if they smoked, then their lungs would be all right, and they don't think it's something bad for you.
I heard that it helps your lungs, as a matter of fact. That's why I thought it's kind of good to smoke it.
Well, I know where this myth starts. It starts at UCLA, where we studied this problem and did find that THC, even marijuana, will dilate the bronchial tubes. Now, unfortunately, marijuana is not good medicine for asthma because it has so many irritants in it.
With cancer, there's another confusion. Marijuana is used for people who have cancer and who are getting cancer chemotherapy and have nausea and vomiting because of the cancer chemotherapeutic drugs. And marijuana does reduce the nausea and vomiting. It has nothing to do with cancer whatsoever. The very same people who think marijuana is harmless think it is a therapeutic agent. Well, the only reason it could possibly be a therapeutic agent is because it's a very powerful chemical. If it weren't doing anything in the body, it wouldn't be potentially useful for a therapy.
Most of our knowledge about the chemicals in marijuana comes from these plants. This field is part of a government research project at the University of Mississippi. The director, Dr. Carlton Turner, supervises the cultivation of the marijuana for scientific research. He also analyzes the chemical content of marijuana seized on the streets. He's worried about the presence of carcinogens, that is, known cancer-causing agents, in marijuana smoke. Because pot users smoke less than tobacco users, they have generally assumed that there is no risk of lung cancer from marijuana smoking. But with the quantities of potent marijuana that today's young chronic smokers are consuming, Dr. Turner thinks there is a risk.
I would say that there's more tar in a cannabis cigarette than there will be in a tobacco cigarette. And the tar here is of a different chemical composition. Some of the chemicals that you find in tobacco smoke, you also find here. In fact, you have more carcinogenic compounds in the smoke from a cannabis cigarette than you do from a single tobacco cigarette of the same size.
Most young people already know that the tar in tobacco smoke contains carcinogens, which can cause cancer. But many do not know that research has shown even more carcinogens in the tar from marijuana smoke.
The plain fact is that the chemicals are there that do cause cancer, and we know that, and we ought to get that message out, that that is a serious problem and a major threat.
Remember that marijuana is kept in the lungs for a long time, much longer than tobacco smoke. It gets way down into the small bronchi, and it's entirely possible that, since it does contain coal tars, that it's a possible cause of cancer.
Considerations of cancer aside, is it possible to compare the effect of a marijuana cigarette on the lungs with the effect of a cigarette made of tobacco?
Yes. In our study at UCLA, Dr. Tashkin found that 5 marijuana joints had the same effect as smoking 112 tobacco cigarettes.
Dr. Tashkin's study was the first direct comparison of the effects of marijuana smoke and tobacco smoke on the human lungs. It showed that 1 marijuana joint produced the same amount of lung inflammation as more than a pack of cigarettes. That lung inflammation shrinks the air passages, making it more difficult to breathe. So the effect on a child's lungs from 5 joints a week is the same as smoking more than 5 packs of cigarettes a week. Let's talk about you, Mr. Strupp. You gave up cigarettes, tobacco, years ago.
Almost 10 years ago, right.
You've smoked marijuana daily for about 10 years.
Correct.
You have bronchitis.
Or at least I seem to cough in the mornings, right.
You cough in the morning sufficiently to make you think you'd better go have a checkup.
That's correct. Well, you know, I'm no different, I suppose, than alcohol drinkers or cigarette smokers at times. I've never known a cigarette smoker yet who didn't occasionally say he was going to quit and occasionally curse the day that they started as they were coughing in the morning, etc. I feel a little of that. I mean, I think marijuana smoking on a daily basis is almost bound to cause some complications in your lungs because you are bringing in smoke into your lungs, and I doubt that that's healthy. I've noticed myself in the last year in particular, I seem to cough in the mornings very much like a cigarette smoker.
Just take a joint like this. Another person comes up to you.
And they blow on that and blow all the smoke right into your lungs?
And you can take it through the nose, too.
Really? What does that do for you?
You cop a super rush, because it's a lot bigger than a toke.
And are all the kids doing this?
Some of the younger ones, you know, don't know how yet or are scared to. Fact of the seeds popping in your mouth, the fire falling down. Some joints tend to run, you know, and the fire can go in your mouth, and it hurts.
Here we're taking a substance, a smoke, inhaling it, and unlike a cigarette smoke, the person purposefully inhales very deeply and then holds it to get the maximum exposure to the deepest part of the lungs. Well, this is a disaster in terms of health consequences.
I don't think it's possible to bring a foreign substance into your lungs, as you do with marijuana, and expect that if you use enough of it over a long period of time that you're not going to have some ill effects. I think you will.
But there is a more immediate effect to marijuana use, intoxication. Now, this device attaches to an automobile dashboard so a driver can toke marijuana while he travels the highway. I'm using pipe tobacco, by the way. The popularity of a gadget like this is another example of how misinformed some of our young people are on the intoxicating effects of marijuana. They have been educated about the dangers of mixing alcohol in driving, but many still cling to the notion that marijuana is different and safe. But tests at the Southern California Research Institute have shown that marijuana severely impairs a driver's perception, concentration, reaction time, and overall driving skill. The tests show that the decrease in driving ability is directly related to the amount of marijuana smoked. They also show that this impairment of driving ability persists for several hours, even after the marijuana smoker no longer feels high. But again, the facts about what this can mean on the highway have not reached many of our young people.
Well, I think anything that you can do when you're straight, you can do when you're high,
Including driving a car?
including driving a car.
On marijuana, you hardly ever hear any car accidents on marijuana, because you always know what you're doing.
For whatever reason, alcohol drinkers for a long time used to claim that they could get drunk and drive all right. It seemed to them they drove all right, even though they ran into the rest of us, and a lot of other people knew all along they couldn't drive well. Well, marijuana smokers, I'm afraid, have fallen for that same line of self-congratulatory. They've generally told each other, hey, man, I can smoke the best marijuana in the world and drive, and it's not like alcohol, it's okay. Well, that's simply not true.
It is a major source of death, of injury, of property loss in the country right now because of drivers stoned on marijuana.
Let me make it clear that the research is now convincing that you should not smoke marijuana and drive an automobile, period. Whether you're an adult or a juvenile doesn't make any difference.
Why isn't this information available to young marijuana smokers?
Just because of our worrying about having every I dotted and every T crossed. We're not saying it clearly, but the evidence is there.
You'll go into health class and there's about maybe a 3-page thing on drug abuse and drugs, and it just says marijuana, mild hallucinogen, and that's just about it.
Would it be fair to say, Dr. Cohen, that the young people in the United States who are now using marijuana regularly are in effect the guinea pigs in an experiment on a national scale?
Well, they're certainly doing things to themselves that we, as researchers, wouldn't do or wouldn't be allowed to do. So, yes, they are guinea pigs. We are learning some of the unhappy sides of marijuana from them.
I think they're making themselves guinea pigs. There's no doubt about it. They are skating on the thinnest of thin ice, and it's a hope that they have that they're not running a very severe health hazard, health risk. I think they're going to lose their bets.
Besides the potential health consequences for the chronic smoker, there's another aspect of the growing use of marijuana by the young. Those 4 million juveniles who use marijuana, even if they merely experiment with it or use it occasionally, have one thing in common. They are breaking the law. In a legal sense, at least, they have become a generation of outlaws. They're on the receiving end of a vast criminal network of marijuana growers, smugglers, and distributors. In many cases, our children are part of that criminal network. It begins here, in the marijuana fields of Colombia, the major source of supply for America's multi-billion-dollar marijuana industry. Officially, marijuana cultivation is illegal in Colombia. But in fact, there is 10 times more marijuana grown in Colombia today than there was just 5 years ago. Nearly all of it is destined for the United States. Most of it leaves Colombia from the northern Guajira Peninsula. From there, a steady stream of freighters, fishing boats, even yachts carries it to delivery points all along the United States coastline. In addition, aircraft leave the Guajira regularly, smuggling tons of marijuana as far north as Chicago.
Obviously, when you're talking about ships bringing in 20 or 30 tons of marijuana at a time, you're not talking about a group of college kids that are off on a lark at spring vacation. You're talking about a syndicate, organized crime. It may not be the mafioso, but it's certainly organized crime dealing in millions of dollars. Sometimes violence. It's a culture that none of us are very proud of.
A charter member of that culture is pilot Robert Eby, now in prison. Last year, Robert Eby was arrested when his DC-4 loaded with Colombian marijuana became stuck in the mud at an airport in Virginia. Before that, he'd made 30 smuggling flights, penetrating the American air defense system each time.
Coming back to the United States, you listen on the radio for flight plans to be filed. And coming out of the Bahamas and out of a lot of Latin American countries, there's no telephones or facility to file a flight plan other than when you get in the air, then you file it over the radio. You listen for somebody to file a flight plan. And being you're in a faster aircraft, say a DC-4 over 172, you try to catch up to where he's at. And before he penetrates, you're on his tail about 30 feet behind him.
So you piggyback
on another plane.
Piggyback on another airplane. And somebody that isn't aware that you're even there. If you'd ever look behind him and see he's about to be eaten up by a big airplane, he'd probably have a heart attack.
Today, the bulk of the incoming marijuana is hauled by freighters like this one. They make offshore deliveries to Americans who smuggle it to distributors' warehouses. There is so much coming in that marijuana literally washes ashore on some Florida beaches. The fact is that despite the best efforts of the American government, this country is being flooded with marijuana.
If you just look throughout the country, marijuana is pervasive. It's all over, at every social level throughout the country. We have made some significant cases. We're continuing to investigate other cases. However, the flow is just so enormous that we are inundated.
I don't really have to go out and find it. It's just somebody comes up and say, hey, you want to smoke one? It finds you more or less than you find it.
If you got the money, you can get the quality to match it. Because I know you can get, all right, green pot is supposedly the worst. Now, don't get me wrong, there's very good green pot also. And then there's gold, which is usually always good. Now, the gold will cost you more than the bad stuff. But if you have the money, you can get just about anything.
We can't essentially deal with the problems of the black market, problems like age controls and quality controls and strength controls. You can't begin to address those problems until you first eliminate the black market and offer a regulated legal market.
I wouldn't recommend that now. It's true we have some, what should we call them, recreational drugs now that are legal and that we wish would go away. But that doesn't mean that we ought to add marijuana to that list.
Do you think marijuana should be legalized?
Yeah. If I was president, I'd have done had it legalized a long time ago. 'Cause there ain't nothing wrong with it.
What would be the big advantages of legalization?
Well, then them people in the store, you'd probably be able to just walk in the store and get a pack of joints, you know, like cigarettes. And then they'd have different brands, I guess, you know, Colombian, Mexican, whatever you want.
Our experience with alcohol and tobacco is so bad that to think about that as a precedent for dealing with marijuana is just, to me, an unthinkable idea.
That debate over legalization has been going on for a long time. While it has, many American schoolyards have become retail outlets for the marijuana industry. In a recent Gallup poll, 81% of American high school students said that marijuana was easy or fairly easy to obtain. Nearly 60% of junior high school students said the same thing. And some children are not just buying reefer, they're selling it. Often they are chronic smokers who deal in order to finance their own marijuana habits.
They usually are selling joints at the bus stop or bags, whatever, during lunch, after school.
Well, once you get a bag, you just roll up joints and sell them. You get your money back, and then you keep what's left over.
Usually when you start, you buy a quarter pound, which is 4 ounces. And that goes for anywhere between 100 and 150. But usually it's about 125. So then you take 3 of those ounces, and you sell them for about 45 apiece, and then you make about $10 and an ounce for your head.
That's for your own use?
Yeah, for my own use. It's just my terms.
Are a lot of kids dealing?
Not a lot, but I'd say enough. Enough to supply the whole entire school.
If they arrested everybody that had some, they'd be arresting just about everybody. Everybody that's, you know, about 13 on up.
To cut down on arrests, some states, like Alaska, have passed decriminalization laws. Basically, this makes the possession of small amounts of marijuana a minor offense, with no jail term or criminal record involved. So far, 11 states have passed such laws. Some people think that's a step in the right direction. Others think that this relaxing of the rules for adult smokers has further confused young people on the subject of marijuana. But you were in the government, Dr. DuPont. You were one of the first policymakers to advocate that criminal penalties be removed for the possession of a certain amount, a small amount of marijuana. Do you think there's a connection between the growing acceptance of that, of decriminalization, and the increase in the number of young marijuana users?
I do. and I think it's tragic. It relates to the fact that for most people, they can only think about an issue in black and white terms. They see support for a fine as opposed to a prison sentence for marijuana possession as being pro-pot. The public, the policymakers, everybody is still way too confused about marijuana. We're not giving clear messages to young people, to anybody about marijuana yet, and then we've got to change that.
What is the clear message you would give?
That marijuana is a dangerous drug.
I think our obligation is to convince people that even if marijuana is dangerous to use, it's not a criminal justice problem. And those who use it should be provided with good information. We should try to convince them that it's not in their best interest to endanger their own health, but we should not confuse them with criminals.
The drug problem is filled with many unpleasant realities. There's none more unpleasant, more painful, or more surprising than the large number of young people who are using marijuana every day and whose lives are affected, distorted, and harmed in many, many ways.
What would it take to convince you to stop?
Well, if I heard something was bad, like it could kill you or make you real sick or something like that, I wouldn't take it. I wouldn't smoke it.
What should our society do about a 12-year-old who smokes marijuana daily? Before we can do anything, we must recognize that Brian and hundreds of thousands like him are a new and special problem. Up to now, our national debate has concerned itself mainly with the occasional use of marijuana by adults. That debate is not likely to end soon. But our children cannot wait. We have to tell them something now. Admittedly, there are still some important things that we don't know about the long-term effects of chronic marijuana use on the human body, especially on children. But in the meantime, our children are not being given the knowledge that is available now. They've not been told that the marijuana they are smoking is 10 times as potent as the stuff that college students were using 5 years ago. They've not been told about the cancer-causing elements in marijuana smoke. Many of them don't even realize that marijuana makes it dangerous to drive a car. It is not the children's fault that they don't know these things. It is the fault of our government, of our schools, of all of us. Edwin Newman, NBC News.